Imagine being in a situation where the law, meant to protect you, turns against you. That's exactly what happened when a team of officers wrongly targeted the wife of a high-ranking commissioner. What seemed like a routine search quickly escalated into a heated confrontation. But the twist? This wasn't just any random civilian. They were messing with someone very powerful. As the tension grew, the officers had no idea what was about to hit them. That was until the commissioner arrived, and everything changed in an instant. His reaction left everyone stunned, but the question remains, how far will someone go when their family is under threat? Stick around to find out what happened next in this shocking turn of events. You won't believe what unfolds. The incident began like any other day. Mrs. Johnson, a quiet woman who rarely attracted attention, was just returning home from her routine errands. What she didn't expect was to be stopped by a group of officers on her doorstep, demanding to search her car without explanation. The officers insisted it was a routine check, but something felt off. She had never been involved in anything remotely illegal, and yet they wouldn't back down. She tried to stay calm, knowing how easily things could escalate, but the officers were growing more aggressive. As the minutes ticked by, Mrs. Johnson's unease turned to frustration. She reached for her phone, ready to call her husband, the commissioner. But before she could even dial, the situation took a turn for the worse. The officers seemed to grow bolder with each passing second. What could have possibly led them to target her like this? And why wouldn't they let her go? As Mrs. Johnson stood there, trying to keep her composure, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't just a random search. The officers were being unusually persistent, almost as if they were looking for something specific. Her heart raced, and she glanced nervously at the street, hoping someone would notice what was happening. But the neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. One officer, standing a little too close for comfort, kept glancing at his watch, then back at her with a cold stare. It was as if he was waiting for something. Or someone. The thought crossed her mind. Was this part of a bigger plan? Had someone tipped them off? But why her? Why now? She was just a regular woman, married to a respected commissioner. Could they really be targeting her? As the minutes dragged on, a sharp sound broke the tension, a car engine revving in the distance. Mrs. Johnson's heart skipped a beat. Was it him? Her husband's arrival was the only thing that could turn this situation around, but why was he taking so long? The officers, sensing her growing anxiety, began closing in. And then, just as things were about to spiral, the unmistakable sound of a siren echoed down the street. It was him, but would he make it in time? The siren grew louder, but still Mrs. Johnson felt the cold grip of fear tightening around her chest. The officers were no longer just searching her car, they were searching her. One of them had already begun questioning her, his tone sharp and accusing. "You have anything to hide, ma'am?" he asked, his eyes cold and unblinking. She could feel the weight of his words, the unspoken threat in the air. Her mind raced. She had to stay calm. She had to buy time until her husband arrived. But the tension was building with every passing second. The officer's hand hovered near his holster, and the others were eyeing her every move. Was this really a routine check, or was something far more sinister happening here? What if they were planning something bigger just then? The car screeched to a halt in front of the house. The doors slammed open, and her husband stepped out, his face a mask of calm authority. But even from a distance, she could see the anger in his eyes. The officers froze. They knew who he was. And in that moment, Mrs. Johnson could feel a shift. But it wasn't over yet. As her husband walked toward the group, his eyes never leaving the officers, a voice called out from behind him. A voice that chilled her to the bone. "Stay right there, Commissioner." The world seemed to hold its breath. The voice that stopped him wasn't just any officers. It came from behind a parked car, and as the figure stepped into view, Mrs. Johnson's stomach twisted. It was someone she recognized, though she never expected to see him here. It was Detective Hall, a man her husband had worked with for years, but his face was far from the familiar one she knew. His expression was tense, his hand resting on the gun holstered at his side. "Hall," her husband called out, his voice tight with confusion. "What the hell is going on here?" Hall didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the officers surrounding Mrs. Johnson, then back at her husband, his eyes narrowing. "You need to step back, Commissioner," he said slowly, his words laced with something unfamiliar. "This is bigger than you think." Mrs. Johnson's heart skipped a beat. What did he mean by that? What could possibly be bigger than a public search on her front doorstep? Before her husband could respond, the tension in the air thickened. Detective Hall gave a slight nod, and suddenly, 2 more unmarked cars pulled up, their engines humming ominously in the stillness of the street. The officers at the scene shifted, standing straighter, almost like they were waiting for something. But what? Why was Hall so insistent on keeping her husband at a distance? As her husband took a cautious step forward, the detective raised his hand, signaling him to stop. "You don't know everything, do you?" Hall's voice dropped to a near whisper, but it was loud enough for everyone to hear. The search wasn't for her. Her husband's eyes widened at Hall's words, a cold chill running down his spine. "What do you mean it wasn't for her?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with confusion. The tension hung thick in the air as the detective's gaze shifted between the officers and Mrs. Johnson, a strange mix of guilt and something else behind his eyes. Before Hall could answer, a harsh voice rang out from the back of the crowd. "You need to tell him now." It was another officer, this time one who had stayed quiet throughout the exchange, but his tone was sharp, authoritative. Hall took a deep breath, his shoulders tense as he stepped closer to the commissioner. The search was for the commissioner, not his wife. "We've been tracking her car for days now, her movements, her meetings." He paused, as if unsure how to continue. The weight of his words seemed to hang in the air. Mrs. Johnson's breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice shaking. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Was it possible? Was she being accused of something? Hall finally locked eyes with her. "The commissioner's been under suspicion for months. We've had intel suggesting he's involved in something far worse than anyone realizes, and we found something tied to you." His gaze shifted, and she could see a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "We thought you might be the link." It felt as if the ground beneath her was crumbling. She turned to her husband, disbelief spreading across her face. "Is this true?" The commissioner's face went pale. For a long moment, he said nothing. But then, with a heavy sigh, he spoke. "I didn't want you to know. I didn't think it would ever come to this." His voice faltered. "I've been investigating something deeper than just local crime. And I thought you were safe. But now this. They've been watching us both." Just as Mrs. Johnson was about to respond, there was another sound, a rustling in the bushes nearby. And then, out from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a woman, with dark hair and sharp features, holding a folder in her hand. She stepped forward, revealing herself as yet another player in this twisted game. "I think it's time we all knew the truth," she said, looking straight at Mrs. Johnson. "Because what you don't know, Commissioner, is that your wife has been playing both sides for longer than you think." Her words hit like a thunderclap, leaving everyone speechless. The twists went over, and the truth, it seemed, was far darker than anyone had imagined. The woman with the folder slowly opened it, revealing evidence that sent shockwaves through the group. Photos, documents, financial records, all pointing to Mrs. Johnson. But as the commissioner took a step closer to his wife, he saw something else, a series of messages, ones that even Hall hadn't seen. They weren't from her. They were planted. Mrs. Johnson looked up, her eyes filled with a mix of confusion and relief. "I didn't do this," she whispered, and for the first time, her husband truly believed her. The woman with the folder was a double agent, trying to frame them both. She had been working with corrupt officials all along, using Mrs. Johnson as the perfect scapegoat. But in the end, it was the commissioner's unwavering loyalty and quick thinking that saved them. As the truth unraveled, They knew their lives would never be the same, but at least now they were together and ready to fight back.